Hi there. I hope you and your loved ones are in good health during these difficult times. Let's start by recapitulating what we discussed in our previous video. In our previous video, we tried to cover the concept of credibility. We said that the credibility test involves two things. One, our personal experience and observations, and two, our background knowledge or information. In the last section of the unit, we also talked about ads and how advertising agencies try to appeal to us by offering products or services that can reduce or dispel our fears and or satisfy our desires. We further discussed that ads might be either with or without reasons. And finally, we rounded off the video by mentioning that in reasonless ads, advertisers try to tap into three areas: our feelings, the people we admire, and the situations we would like to find ourselves in. Let's talk about the aims of the session. But before we start, let me just tell you something that we need to consider before I go ahead. Throughout this video, I might ask some questions. Please pause the video and answer those questions. Then you can play the video again to listen to the rest of the video and possibly some of the answers. This way you might be able to remember the information for a longer period of time as you spend some time reflecting on the question. This means a deeper level of thinking and cognition, which is usually conducive to better learning. Well, then with this snippet, I guess we are ready to start the chapter. Let's see what we'll be covering in the chapter. Okay? Now we have the aims. Please pause the video and have a look at what our aims are. Okay, did you pause the video and read the aims? As you can see, we'll be talking about different rhetorical bells or whistles, or what some people might call slanters, because the information they believe is presented in a particular way which can be unfair or misleading. Now, let's start with some common devices people use to persuade us to do things. Please pause the video and answer this question. What do people do to draw our attention? Please pause. The question was, what do people do to catch our attention? Good. I'm sure you had some ideas. Did you mention any of these? Good. People usually use images and words to win us to their point of view. If words are used, we often talk about their persuasive power. Or if you recall, we had the word or the phrase rhetorical force or emotive meaning. What do we use these devices for? Obviously, we use them to affect people's attitudes, their opinions or behavior. This is what rhetoric is all about. That is to affect people's attitudes, opinions, and behavior. Rhetoric, according to Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, refers to a speech or writing that is intended to influence people. But that is not completely honest, they say, or it could be insincere. It refers to some linguistic devices we use to affect people's attitudes, opinions, or behavior. If I talk about my friend and I say that friend is someone I like, and imagine my friend is too short, I would probably say, if someone asked me about his or her height, I would say that he or she is not that tall. I wouldn't say that the person is too short. The rhetorical force of my statement is that I am obviously I'm trying to mute, or better say minimize, the disagreeable aspect of my statement about my friend's height. In this unit, we'll try to see what some people do to mask our judgments, that is, by resorting to rhetoric. Now, maybe I should repeat myself by saying that there is nothing wrong with rhetoric, if I have already mentioned this. As we often try to do so, I mean, to use these rhetorical devices, and that's what good writers and speakers do. But remember that we should be able to distinguish what is logically correct from what is psychologically effective. So yes, rhetoric makes what we say more beautiful, but by no means can it make it more valid or stronger. So as I said, we can use words, images, or both to compel people's attention. Now, look at another photo on the next slide and then think why we would consider it effective, rhetorically effective. Okay, so you can think about it, and in the comment section you can write why you think this is effective. To get your head around the contents of the chapter, it might be a good idea to brush over what we discussed in chapter 1 about rhetoric. Remember in chapter 1, when we were discussing arguments, we said sometimes there are some flourishes or ornaments we use as extraneous stuff to mask what we are saying as arguments. This is what we will be discussing more in this chapter. But it's good to remember that an argument attempts to prove or support a conclusion. Then we respectively call these arguments deductive or inductive reasoning. But rhetoric, on the other hand, tries to make something more sellable, if you like. We want people to buy into the idea we are presenting, or better say, the idea we are selling. I will quote John F. Kennedy's famous quotation, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," which simply put just meant do voluntary work. Well, of course, in a rhetorically pretty package. This is pretty much like what advertisers do. That is, they try to persuade you to buy. In a sense, people buy into an idea maybe better or more if we use the rhetoric and rhetorical devices, right? And that is, as we called earlier, the emotive power of the language. And that is what John F. Kennedy did, or rather than simply saying, do voluntary work. So let's go deeper into these devices that we can use to influence people psychologically. The first of these would be euphemism and dysphemism. Well, let's see what euphemism means. Euphemism is actually from a Greek word. EU at the beginning of euphemism is a Greek root which means good, well, or advantageous, and is the opposite of dis, which means bad, ill, or difficult. And pheme means speech. So literally speaking, euphemism means good speech, and dysphemism means bad or offensive speech or language. So euphemism is an indirect word or phrase that people often use to refer to something embarrassing or unpleasant, sometimes to make it seem more acceptable than it really is. So think of a word like die. Obviously, die is a neutral word, but when we are talking to a friend who has recently lost a relative or an immediate family member, we wouldn't use the word die, although it is neutral. We use the word pass away. So pass away is the euphemistic form of die. Now here you have some other examples. You can pause the video and see what they are. Dysphemism is the opposite of euphemism, and in this case, if there is a neutral word, you try to make it sound worse than it might really be. Let's go back again to the word die. Die, we said, is a neutral word, but if I use the word kick the bucket, definitely I'm using dysphemism. All right, let's now look at two other devices. Remember in chapter 3 we talked about 4 types of definition. What were they? Yes. Number 1, we had lexical definitions, then stipulative definitions, precising definitions, and finally persuasive or rhetorical definitions. Persuasive definitions, also known as rhetorical definitions, are not like dictionary definitions, but the definitions we use to influence people's attitudes or beliefs about something. The example I gave you was love. What does love mean? Then we just say love means washing the dishes when she is tired. You see, this kind of definition is intended to elicit an attitude towards something, be it positive or negative. So this was rhetorical definition, a definition intended to elicit an attitude. What about rhetorical explanation? Now, instead of defining a word, if we present facts, then we are using explanations. But then if I embellish those explanations by using more beautiful or impressive words, then we are resorting to rhetorical explanations. Now, pause the video and say what the writer is saying in this quotation. Okay, did you read? Well, we understand here that the writer is against affirmative action, but he's not presenting any facts. So this is a textbook example of a rhetorical explanation. By the way, what we consider as affirmative action describes the policies that support members of a disadvantaged group that has previously suffered of discrimination in such areas as education, employment, or housing. In other words, this is a way to offset all the wrongdoings leveled against disadvantaged groups. Again, as you see, we are using these rhetorical devices to manipulate people's feelings, say favorably or unfavorably. All right, stereotyping. Well, I think everyone is familiar with the idea. That is having a fixed idea that people might have about some other people or things and claiming that they are alike. But this is usually done in a wrong way, or the idea is wrong. We have all heard of the phrase, women are the weaker sex, right? You can even see this in an advertisement in this advertisement here that I have presented on the slide. Now, I'll show you a picture and ask you a question. See how I include stereotyping in my question even. Do you see a group of women who hate men? What was my question reeking of? Stereotyping? Definitely. Why? Because I was implying that feminists are misandrists. I mean, they hate men. Is this acceptable? Obviously not, but why is it that people readily use it and yet some accept it? This often happens to induce the audience to accept a claim, and it's easy to do so, especially if people do not know very much about them. If I don't know about feminists, I take it for granted that they are men haters, simply because they just fight for women's rights. This is a way of what they consider othering maybe too. That is focusing on the differences between us and them, Muslims and Christians, Americans and Europeans, men and women, categories and categories and categories and end. And I guess this is one of the most serious problems we have in the world these days. Anyways, the more common types of stereotyping are like grouping people or categorizing them, or thinking of, for instance, the people of one city as stingy, people of another city as having liberal ideas, and so on and so forth. Innuendo, by definition, it is an indirect remark about something or somebody, usually suggesting something bad or rude. Innuendos about someone's private life, for instance, are not very pleasant things to hear, maybe. Here, the term refers to making or having someone understand something without clearly and directly saying so. This can be rude or even an insult. If you walk into, if you leave the class for a few seconds and then you come back and there is no one except me, and then you say, "Where's my wallet?" You're not saying directly that I have stolen it, but when your wallet is gone, you're suggesting that I have stolen it. Yet if there are two people and then you go out and come back and again you say, "Where's my wallet?" and I say, "I didn't take it," what do I suggest now? It means probably the other person took it. So as you can see, this is a statement in which I'm trying to imply, or I'm implying something rude. There are some phrases that we usually use when we are using innuendo. Things like, "if you know what I mean," I suppose, or an adverb like "interestingly," "surprisingly." We can signal the use of innuendo. Sometimes I might say, for example, "surprisingly, everyone likes his class." Well, this is more like an insult. Why are you surprised that everyone likes that teacher's class or lessons? Next, we have loaded questions. Another way of innuendo is loaded questions. Remember, innuendo is a kind of umbrella term. If you're saying something indirectly, which is not usually a very kind one, then you're resorting to innuendo. Anyways, loaded questions. Take a look at this question. A lawyer could ask a defendant, "What were you doing there on the night the murder happened?" Now, let's look at the question again. What were you doing there on the night the murder happened? You see, the question has the assumption that the person was there. And we would just like to know what he was doing there. Excuse me. The question is not, "Were you there at the time?" and then followed by, when the person says yes, followed by, "What were you doing there?" Likewise, if I ask you, "Did you eat the other cake too?" I am assuming that you have already had one. Maybe this assumption is not fair, as you have not eaten the cake at all. But my question was based on unwarranted or unjustified assumptions or presumptions. As you see in the picture here in the question, when did you start cheating? I take it for granted that you have cheated, but I'm just asking about the time. Next, we have weaselers. Well, let me just tell you that weaseler is taken from the verb weasel, and weasel out of something, which is an informal word often used to mean to avoid doing something that you ought to do or have promised to do. Now, if you, for instance, try to weasel out of your agreement with someone, it means you just try to ignore it. So if you try to, if you use a sentence and try to reduce the risk of losing or making a mistake by supporting more than one side in a competition, an argument, or by having several choices available to yourself, you are using whistlers, or what is also known as hedging. This means you're avoiding or weaseling out of responsibility. This is also known as a form of innuendo. Words such as perhaps, maybe, possibly, seem are some of these whistlers. A word of caution: not always do we use such phrases as seem or perhaps or maybe to find a way out. Actually, sometimes we use them to express a reasonable amount of doubt. It is up to you as a critical thinker to decide and distinguish these to see which one is which. Downplayers. Downplaying is about belittling. The devices that we have used so far might be used to make someone or something look less important than they are. Now, these slanders are words that are used to convince someone on emotional rather than logical level. If someone asks you whether this car belongs to me, what would your response be? Now look at this short dialogue. Yeah, well, we are definitely going to say, if a person says, "Is this car Reza's?" You would say he's just a teacher. You would say he's a teacher. You would say, "I don't know." Well, if you say here he's just a teacher, you're using a downplayer, just. Now, if you just say he's a teacher, you're stereotyping him, saying that teachers are not usually well paid, so he can't possibly have this car. But if you say he's just a teacher, now you are using a downplayer here. Well, there are some terms that we can use, like just, like mere, like merely, so-called, and whatever, to downplay or belittle something or somebody. A word like so-called, for example. The so-called expert told us to keep our social distance. Then I'm definitely downplaying the expertise of the person, maybe. Horse laugh, ridicule, and sarcasm. Well, I'm sure you're familiar with sarcasm, and ridicule and horse laugh are the words which are interchangeably used with sarcasm. Sarcasm comes from the Greek word sark, which means flesh, and osmos, which means to tear or rip. So literally it means to tear the flesh. Sarcasm is not always intended to be vicious or mean. It can also be humorous or funny. Remember, verbal irony plus the tone of voice makes something sarcastic. As you can see, this girl is saying lovely, but the way the expression on her face suggests that this really is not really. Okay, if I say something like, oh, yes, you've been most helpful, I don't know how to appreciate it. And if I draw out, as you noticed, I prolonged or drew out the vowel O in most, I was trying to be sarcastic. Or if I have my mug on the table and you drop it by accident and you break it, if I say that's just great, this great obviously doesn't mean that it is great, right? I think it's clear, and I do not need to dwell on this for a very long time. Now, another term I'm sure you're all familiar with is hyperbole. Hyperbole is a way of speaking or writing that makes something sound better, uh, maybe sound more exciting or even more dangerous, etc., etc. Uh, then it really is a kind of exaggeration, or better say, exaggeration for better effect. If I say something weighs a ton when I'm lifting it, I definitely do not want to say that I'm the strongest person in the world for lifting something that heavy. I'm just using a hyperbole. Likewise, when you put your head on a pillow and say it's like a brick, you don't literally mean that it is a brick you're putting your head on. You are resorting to exaggeration for effect. Hyperbole can be used to ridicule people too. Uh, but remember that we do not need excessively emotive words for hyperbole. In the examples I gave you, neither brick nor ton were emotive or had this emotive force. Proof surrogates. Uh, let's see what surrogate means, and then we would be able to find out what proof surrogates mean. Surrogate is used to describe a person or thing that takes the place of or is used instead of somebody or something else. Uh, when you are making a claim that somebody said something, you usually use the person's name. But if you do so without citing them, then you're using proof surrogates. That is, you're using not the proof, but a proof surrogate. In newspapers, sometimes they say an informed source, an official said so. It's obvious that studies shows, researchers believe. These are all forms of proof surrogates. Remember, proof surrogates are not real proof or evidence. Such proof or evidence may exist, but until we are sure they exist, the claim remains unsubstantiated or unsupported. They suggest maybe some sloppy research where we don't know who said this thing, claiming that researchers believe. Or sometimes it might just be propaganda. Our next rhetorical devices are rhetorical analogies and misleading comparisons. I'm sure you're all familiar with simile and metaphor. When we were talking about the rhetorical analogies, we were talking about similes and metaphors which are used. When we say lion, we usually use a lion to symbolize bravery, right? So if I say John is a lion or John is like a lion, I mean he's brave. But am I giving you any reason or justification for accepting my point? Not really. So when we say something is known among people as good or bad, trustworthy or untrustworthy, if we liken a new thing to that, then we don't need to prove it as it is known to everyone. But as I said, this is no argument. But what about misleading comparisons? Likewise, some comparisons, just like rhetorical analogies, might be misleading because they're incomplete. If I say this is 10% better, what do I mean? 10% of what? 10% of nothing? That's nothing. Better? What does better mean? Better than what? Now here are some questions to consider when we see some comparisons which you think are, I mean, we are putting it to test to see whether they're incomplete or they're fine. One is important information missing? So if I say I took office and after I took office there has been a 300% increase in the number of airports, then I would just say you haven't identified how long you've taken the office. Maybe it's been like 30 years, maybe it's been like 1 week. We don't know what the time frame is. Is the same standard of comparison used? Like if I say thousands of young people are facing long-term unemployment. What does unemployment mean? Well, I'll just give you an example about Iran. For some time, unemployment was used for, I don't remember the exact number, but was used for anyone who worked below, let's say, 10 hours. But then after a change in the labor, I don't know, rules and policies and whatever, they changed this to 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, I don't know what. Now, here, as you can see, a lot of people who are working like 6, 7, 8 hours are considered to be employed now. So you see the standard of comparison has changed. Obviously, this is a misleading comparison when I say that the government has created job opportunities for people. Next, are the items comparable? Like if I say, let's compare the taste of an apple and an orange, obviously they're not comparable. You might like one better than another, but this doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's not a comparison. It's just a matter of taste. And is the comparison mentioned as an average or is it not? Well, of course, this might be a little bit technical. Because when we are talking about an average, we are talking about the arithmetic mean. We are not talking about median and mode. So that is what some statisticians might play with, and we might be very careful with that as well. Well, if you recall, we just said that people use words or pictures or images to influence others and their beliefs and opinions and attitudes. Well, we are not going to spend a lot of time on this. We know that sometimes they deliberately manipulate, especially with these applications that are available. Photoshop is one perfect example. They add things, they delete things, they combine them. They sometimes do not alter the images, but they use misleading captions. They select camera angles from different perspectives. I mean, just changing all this. This could even distort information. And we have some beautiful images in the book as well. You can have a view. Okay, now here is the last slide, I think, or the last but one. It's about the aims. Please pause the video and see whether we have covered all of them or not. Thank you for watching. Please share the assignments on Google Classroom. Stay home, stay safe. See you soon. By the way, I'll send you the assignment on Google Classroom. Goodbye.